Hello everyone and welcome to another Bentley Davey Tutors video. If you haven't already, make sure to leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel so that you don't miss any of these. You don't really have to. I know I never liked being asked to subscribe, but if you want to, it's great. It means a lot to us. And so it'd be really, really good if you could. But obviously, it's not the end of the world if you don't. But today's topic for today's video will be Australia's involvement in both world wars. I will be discussing a huge number of different aspects of war, things like the causes, the nature of war, and the role of Australia specifically within those wars. And so how I'm essentially going to do it is I'm going to go through each of the sections that I've developed that I think would be really helpful in learning about this topic, and I'm going to look at firstly what it was like in World War One, and then secondly what it was like in World War Two, and then maybe a bit of a comparison between these, or there might be some comparative language intertwined in there. So I think just before we begin, this video will talk about the stories of people who have lost their lives, and we thank them for serving so that we can have the peace that we have today. So now into the video, I think what I wanted to start with was the causes of both wars. So we're going to start off with World War One, and also just a quick side note, if I happen to have a drink of water, I apologise for that, just because I'm a bit thirsty, and I couldn't be bothered to cut it out. But so we'll start with World War One. So I've identified 5 main causes and 5 main reasons that World War One was able to start in the way it did. So firstly, we had rising imperialism around the world, which brought around major gaps between power and money of nations, and we had a lot of countries being almost jealous of each other. For example, Germany and Austria-Hungary were quite jealous of the British and French economies, which were performing very well at the time and were performing better than those of the nations that I just mentioned. And then secondly, we had major nationalism, which arose as different nations became more and more self-centered over time. They began to focus a lot more on their own survival as opposed to that of the world and other countries around them. And as well as this, nations such as Australia, New Zealand and Canada looked at the war to try and give a national identity and prove themselves. Because these nations were all colonies of Britain, a lot of their history and their culture was tied to Britain, and they did look to these wars to try and bring about their own national identity and bring about some of their own national culture. As well as this, we had big alliances beginning to form between nations in Europe. We had the Triple Entente Alliance, which featured Britain, France and Russia. And we had the Triple Alliance, which wasn't as creative of a name, but that's the English translation. I'm sure other languages would have had a better translation, but it's which had Germany, Austria-Hungary and Italy. And so our fourth reason was that a majority of European nations started rapidly militarizing. Such as Britain, France and Germany, who spent $50, $40 and $60 million respectively on their military in the years leading up to and during World War One. This rapid militarization also made everybody feel a bit less safe in Europe, and it put everybody sort of on high alert and raised tensions a lot. So we saw there that a lot of the stuff that led up to World War One was nations sort of focusing a bit more on themselves and how they could push themselves forward in terms of their economies and in terms of their military. But now if we move over to World War Two, I found 4 main components here that really led to World War Two, and specifically to the rise of Nazi Germany. So firstly, we had the Treaty of Versailles and Hitler's appeasement. This treaty was signed by both sides after the war, after World War One, of course, and it signalled the cost of the war that would fall upon the losers. However, this treaty was quite poorly done, and it is often quoted to have been both too hard and too soft. This treaty basically put full responsibility for the war onto Germany, and it held a lot of restrictions for them moving forward. This treaty meant that they were unable to have any sort of armed force or any sort of air force. They were also made to pay huge war reparations of 132 million gold marks, or about 270 billion US dollars today. This was unpayable for Germany. In any event, it would have been incredibly hard for any nation to pay this sort of money, but after just losing a war, you do not have enough money to pay for this. And so it actually put the nation into an even worse position. So when someone came around and said that they could fix everything, it was hard to resist that opportunity. So secondly, we had the Great Depression coming across the world. So the Great Depression was to the same tune here, as when the US stock market crashed in 1929, it led to to severe economic downturn for most of the world. And again, when somebody comes along and says that they can fix all these economic problems, it's hard to say no to that. So thirdly, we had the rise of militarism, again in Japan and Germany. Both of these nations began strong dictatorships and began to militarize hugely, with Germany under Adolf Hitler taking land in the Rhineland, which was directly prohibited under the Treaty of Versailles, and Japan under Tojo Hideki taking land in China. Finally, we had the appeasement and the failure of the League of Nations. These two ideas were meant to move towards negotiation instead of violence in order to deal with problems. However, both of them were infamously ineffective. Britain and France's appeasement strategy of Hitler mainly revolved around the idea of giving Hitler small pieces of land when he wanted them, if he promised not to take any more. The problem there is he, unsurprisingly, didn't stop, and so this process repeated and repeated with no results. This allowed Hitler to ignore almost everything in the Treaty of Versailles, as well as those parts about making a military. He famously remarked that it was one of the most useless treaties ever created. And the League of Nations also failed to intervene here in any sort of conflicts because they had no armed force, and so they weren't really able to step in and do anything. So that's sort of what I had on the start of the war and the onset of war and the reasons why it happened in both wars. I hope that gives sort of a good example of how the war really started, and it can maybe help you to familiarize yourself with how such a tragic event could have actually occurred. So next I'm going to move on to the nature of war and the conditions for the soldiers and on the home front a bit, but I'll touch more on the home front a bit later. So firstly on the conditions in World War I. So World War I was fought mostly in Europe, and therefore the conditions were mostly the traditional wet and cold winter months, and the fairly dry and in some cases warmer summer months that Europe sees. And at the beginning of war, in terms of the actual fighting conditions, everything was fought fairly traditionally, and some might say fairly nobly, with examples of this being things like letting people escape off a ship before it is torpedoed, or arranging times and locations for battles. However, by the end of the war, through the development of new weapons and strategies, this was lost, to a win-at-all-costs mentality. At this stage in history, weapons were all still fairly basic. Most infantrymen were equipped with a single rifle and bayonet, and machine guns were in heavy use throughout the war. Some weapons or more technologies, however, were still strongly lacking, such as planes, which were at this stage mostly used for reconnaissance and couldn't really shoot and couldn't really hold any bombs or artillery. And tanks as well, which were very, very slow at the time and were more used as human shields than anything else. Finally, rations and medical supplies weren't great, with soldiers living on poor quality and quantities of food, mainly due to the disintegration of supply chains, and production and medical care supplies again weren't great because of the war being in a time with limited medical technology. So obviously the conditions here really weren't good for anyone. So then we had the nature of war in World War II. So World War II was fought far more broadly here, with campaigns in Europe, the Mediterranean, and the Pacific. So to look more specifically at them, we have Europe first. There were more specific campaigns such as the Battle of Britain, France, and the Western Front in Europe, and these soldiers here once again were suffering from those poor European conditions that I mentioned before. In the Mediterranean, there was a fair amount of Australian involvement, that in North Africa, which I will discuss more later. But both sides in conflicts such as Libya and Egypt were overheated and undersupplied, which made the fighting experience an arduous process. And finally in the Pacific, the fighting was far closer to home for Australian soldiers, as I mentioned before, which added to its importance and intensity. The campaigns mostly consisted of the US and Australian forces island hopping to try and outplay the Japanese on a march to the mainland, or the fighting that took place in other regions such as Kokoda. Technology was also far better in World War II, as we saw planes being able to carry huge amounts of weaponry into battles and be one of the most effective forms of weaponry used throughout the war, with air superiority being a key player in the Battle of Britain and D-Day. Tanks had advanced hugely, and battleships had been heavily developed, and finally, the introduction of the atomic bomb changed warfare forever. Rations and medical supplies had now also increased due to the advancements in technology at the time. So I was next going to look at the idea of recruitment and conscription in both wars. And there's a bit of contrast, but then also a bit of overlap in how recruitment and conscription occurred in Australia specifically. So in World War One, there was an attempt to bring in conscription in order to properly supply the army with enough troops to be able to fight effectively. However, after it failed to pass in 2 separate referendums, the idea was abandoned. Volunteers for the war fought in the AIF, or the 1st Australian Imperial Force, a volunteer army that could constitutionally fight overseas. There were a lot of people opposed to the idea of conscription generally, and the war as a whole, because it took up a huge amount of manpower that really puts a strain on the workforce. This can be seen more specifically in industries such as manufacturing, who really do require that amount of people to be in there and to be working. And during the war, recruitment posters were often used and followed 2 main styles, being those that evoked fear of the enemy, such as the one just here, and those that imposed the idea of guilt for not fighting, such as this one. Finally, a lot of Australians volunteered for the war because of the prestige and honour that was associated with this deed. But Australians were also excited and often filled with a sense of adventure and a huge amount of nationalism, as the war, on the whole, worked to develop Australia's national identity. In World War II, however, everything was different. All of the enthusiasm towards war had been lost to the knowledge of the horror and terrible conditions seen by the soldiers in World War I, and understandably, you wouldn't be too keen on going back into that again. There was still some of that guilt that I mentioned earlier, as it could be seen as cowardly to not go off and fight, and men also often enlisted to follow in the lineage of their fathers or uncles who may have fought in World War I. There was also a much different threat this time, as war came far closer to home, with Japan's advancement in the Pacific causing more of a threat of invasion. Finally, though never having fully introduced conscription, Australia introduced policy in which, in 1939, all unmarried men aged 21 were required to complete 3 months of military training. And then, in 1942, conscription was essentially enforced when all men aged 18 to 35 and single men aged 35 to 45 were required to join the Citizens Military Force, who aided the 2nd AIF, which was the voluntary force in the Second World War. So as we can see, the idea of conscription was heavily debated because obviously there are a lot of ethical questions that come around making people go and fight as opposed to them just volunteering. But I think the next thing that we should look at is the idea of being a civilian under wartime controls in both of these wars. So as you may know, the Australian government and many governments around the world put in wartime controls in order to enforce this idea of a total war, which is when the entire nation is making sure that they are involved in the war effort and that we are functioning as effectively as possible. So there are 2 key ideas when it comes to thinking about the effect of wartime controls on civilians and the country as a whole, these being the economy and mental health. So firstly, in World War I, the economy. Before World War I began, the Australian workforce was comprised of mainly male workers. This was a major problem when World War I began, as a large amount of Australia's workforce left the country and therefore left the economy. As well as being left with a hole in the workforce, Australia also lost the ability to trade and import various goods, such as tea. The government were not prepared for the economic impact that the war would have, so they did not have precautions in place. This led to financial hardship for many families in Australia, which had long-lasting effects. As well as this, the prices of everyday goods increased, as the government chose to print more money, which led to inflation. There were also wartime bonds that people could purchase. However, they didn't have much of an impact, except for making people feel more involved in the war effort. So in terms of mental health, the Australian population had never seen a war of this scale ever before. They had no idea what to expect. And as strange as it may seem, it actually led to many people being quite optimistic about the war. Many people believed that the war would be over in a few months, and that their brothers and husbands and sons would be home soon. But as the war went on, their hopes dwindled. But nevertheless, there were times of optimism. Another point is that this war was only 4 years long, compared to World War II, being 6 years long. Also, there weren't many fears of there being an attack on Australian soil, as the fighting on the whole was happening on the other side of the world. Finally, there weren't many strict government controls about what people could and couldn't do, so they could still experience a sense of freedom. So as we can see there, in terms of wartime controls and being a civilian under wartime controls, World War I was quite relaxed as opposed to World War II. It was obviously still a time of much stress for many, many people, but it paled in comparison to what was seen in World War II. So in World War II, again, we have those same two ideas of the economy and mental health. So firstly, on the economy. The government had seen what had happened to the economy during the First World War, so they were able to legislate more policies which would help to protect the economy. Firstly, they were much more conscientious about the importance of trade, and therefore worked to ensure that trade agreements continued with the Allied countries during the war. It can be argued that Australia actually profited in the long term from World War II. This was for two reasons. Firstly, the Australian manufacturing industry significantly developed and diversified to take on demand. It had a big boom during this period. They were consistently sending supplies to other countries which needed them during the war. Secondly, there was a higher focus on rationing. This leads to an increase in demand for supplies, as there was a never-ending want for more supplies. Also, the workforce became stronger in the long term as a result of being more socially acceptable for women to be in the workforce, which I'll touch on a lot more later in the changing role of women. As well as this, on the idea of mental health, this time around, people knew what to expect when it came to another world war. They knew that there was a good chance they wouldn't get to see their family for a long time, if even to see them again at all. Also, this war was 2 years longer than the first, so the population had more to endure. As well as this, there were widespread fears of a Japanese invasion. The Japanese were a power in World War II and were quite close to the northern parts of Australia, and the Japanese did launch a few attacks on Australian soil, which increased that fear of a full invasion. Some people also feared as a result of conscription, which would mean some people may have to go and fight against their will, as I was mentioning before. So that's sort of the idea of civilians under wartime controls. I'm sure there are more people out there who can tell you a lot more about being a civilian under wartime controls and about the wartime controls specifically. But when you are talking about wartime controls, you're talking about things like rationing, the treatment of enemy aliens, and also majorly just restricting their freedoms on what people can and can't do. Almost sort of like what we have today in terms of COVID restrictions. Okay, so I next thought that we would have a look at a significant event for Australia from both wars. Now, I have realised that this video is dragging on a bit, so I will try and speed up as much as I can. So, yeah, I thought that a good idea here when looking at the wars would be to look at a significant event for Australian soldiers and Australia as a whole from each war. So for the First World War, I chose to look at the Gallipoli campaign. The Gallipoli campaign was a huge part of this war for Australian soldiers, and to this day has contributed heavily to Australian identity and the development of it. This still makes up one of the major parts of the Anzac legend and the idea of the Anzac spirit. This was the first major offensive for Anzac forces in Europe, and it was essentially their first taste of what it would be like to be on the battlefield. The Anzacs landed on Anzac Cove and faced huge resistance as they seek to scale massive cliffs and beaches to reach high ground. These men essentially walked up cliffs while being shot at. This campaign, on the whole, was a major stalemate, with both sides taking thousands of casualties and many losses. In the end, however, the Gallipoli campaign was a crushing defeat for the Anzacs and the Allies. Two major offensives here were the Battle of Lone Pine and the Battle of the Neck. Firstly, in the Battle at Lone Pine, on the 6th to the 9th of August 1915, there were 2,000 Anzac casualties while they launched the offensive, a huge number, but the Turkish ended up losing 7,000 to casualties and a significant portion of land, resulting in an Allied victory for this battle. However, a conflicting battle was that of the Neck, where Allied battalions were launched into enemy fire. The Anzacs were decimated, with 230 Anzacs killed in the first 45 minutes alone. This campaign was huge for the Anzac spirit and the Australian national identity. Unfortunately, it came at a grave cost. However, in World War II, there was a slightly more successful event, where we look at the Rats of Tobruk. This battle and siege required a huge amount of Australian involvement and fighting power, which has actually allowed it to implant itself in Australian legend. Tobruk was a major city for both sides of the conflict because of its port and location in North Africa. And when the Allies seized it from the Axis powers in 1941, it was put under siege by the Axis powers for 241 days. Australian troops were key to this defence, as they were most of the manpower actually within the city defending it. And when they were eventually removed from the city to fight elsewhere, the city fell to Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps almost immediately, showing how important they were in this conflict. They have become known as the Rats of Tobruk in Australian legend because of the idea that they were almost unkillable, and they were able to hold out for so long with little to no faults. So the final thing that I wanted to look at today is the changing role of women within society during the wars. So obviously, during both wars, a huge proportion of the male workforce had to leave and fight overseas. And so this really changed the way that women interacted with society. So with a major loss in World War I of a huge amount of working men from the population, there were thousands of jobs required to be filled. As well as this, the idea of total war, which I mentioned before, in which everyone contributes in some way to the war effort, these jobs needed to be filled in order to hold up the Australian workforce. This meant thousands of women moving into completely new jobs, often being some of their first times working jobs outside the home. These jobs were mainly in things like manufacturing, food production, resource processing, and many of the other industries that were absolutely crucial to making sure that the nation could still supply itself with everything that it needed, as well as supplying a battlefront across the world. This was fairly good for women as well, however, as it did equip them with many new skills that could be used and applied in other aspects of life. Unfortunately, however, when the men returned home, they wanted their jobs, which is understandable. And so most of these women were forced to go back into the home, and they did lose these jobs that they had, which was a bit of a step backwards. But the skills that they were able to develop was good for them on the whole. So secondly, in World War II, we had this very similarly, but on a slightly larger scale. So in World War II, a very similar thing happened when the workforce lost a significant amount of its workers, and the women left at home were required to fill in. However, as times moved further forward, the idea of women working outside the home has normalised hugely, and this second wave of women coming into the workforce during World War II was a contributing factor to that. Some of these women were now able to become far more independent and became themselves far more of a crucial part of the workforce than they had previously been. Finally, women did take a step forward here as well. In almost every industry, 70 to 80% of women employed in wartime jobs said that they would be wanting to keep those jobs after the war had ended. And even those who were forcibly removed by men returning looked to move into other jobs or other parts of the workforce so that they could stay in this workforce for a litany of reasons, such as economic freedom, the want to purchase their own things, and general satisfaction for working that had arisen from the experience of work. Some of these changes for women can also be attributed to things such as the suffrage movement not long after the war. So as we can see, women played a crucial role in making sure that the country and the fighting front overseas could still function in both wars. And so that's all we have time for in today's video, and I really hope that I've covered a decent amount. You may have noticed, but I have a screen behind me with all the notes on it, and it was about 10 pages, so I hope I've gotten in everything that you could need to know. If there is more that you want to know, I'm sure that you can definitely find more videos on that. That will probably be far more educational than this one is. But if you have any individual questions, you can DM us on Instagram and follow us on Instagram at Bentley Davey Tutors. And as I said at the start of the video, if you want to, drop a like, subscribe, takes like 10 seconds. But yeah, we really appreciate it. And once again, we send many thanks to all those who served so that we could have the peace that we have today. Thank you and goodbye.